A team without conflict is potentially living in this state of false harmony, artificial harmony, where actually, because we are afraid to say what we think, or we don't want to say what we think, or we can't be bothered to say what we think, we don't want to share our views for a multitude of reasons, there's actually topics don't get bubbled to the surface. They don't have that full discussion. And unless we allow everybody to have their say, how can we possibly expect people then to buy in to whatever decision has been made?
Hello, I'm your host, Joe Espana, and this is the GOBO Podcast, where we skip the guru talk and get real about the things we often overlook. No need for fancy theories here, just a second look at what's often as clear as day, but still manages to slip by us. Here's something I've been thinking about for a while. Conflict in teams. Not the kind that makes you dread meetings, but the kind that actually moves things forward. Are we too conflict averse? And is that hurting our teams? So I sat down with my longtime friend and colleague Gary Blissett to hash it out. I think you'll find this conversation pretty interesting. Teams need more conflict of the right kind, not less. Gary, how are you doing? So great to see you.
I'm good, really good. Looking forward to catching up today.
Thanks for joining me. Last time we were together, we chinwagged about how styles and a leadership style influences what goes on with a team. And at the back end of last year, I was doing quite a lot of work with intact teams. And this subject of how they deal with conflict keeps coming up. So I'm going to propose that teams need more conflict, but the caveat is that they have to be effective or, master how they manage those conflicts at work. So that's what I want to talk to you about.
Cool. That's a big statement, Joe.
I think you and I agree on the substance, but maybe we ought to define what we're talking about. Give me your definition of this notion of conflict in teams. How would you define it?
Certainly in the work we do, there's an awful lot of talk about conflict, but actually it is in a specific context. I like to use the Lencioni model, which is about conflict, and the context of this is about having debate focused on concepts and ideas and solving problems. It's about that injection into a business conversation. I would dispute that teams need more argumentative, mean, ugly conflict with people falling out and banging the table and screaming. So, I think it's about, as long as there's a bit of passion around a topic in order to find the best outcome, love that idea of conflict. Not so convinced the world would be a better place if we all shouted at each other more.
I do like to be a little provocative, Gary, but I'm in total agreement with you. We're trying to hone in on two different types of conflict. One type ends up being destructive to relationships, mood, and the team. Affective conflict is basically about how I feel about you, how you feel about me, and the behaviors, sort of negative behaviors around that. And sometimes you hear people talk about personality clash, but it's affective conflict. The one you're talking about is cognitive conflict. Exactly right, around ideas, perspectives, notions, views of the world, etc., which are not about I hate you, you hate me. It's about the concept and how can we view it from different perspectives and still move the thing forward. So that's really our context, really, isn't it? When I say teams need more conflict, well, they need more conflict around cognition and ideas rather than people not getting on. When the subject of conflict comes up in working with teams, one of the things I do is I say to them, on a piece of paper, write down 4 words that come to mind when you think of the idea of conflict. A vast majority of the words that come back are negative. Clash, heated debate, we don't like each other, negativity. The vast majority of people's perceptions around the notion of conflict is a negative one.
Yeah.
And that's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And there's, I don't think that's ever a surprise. That's the common parlance and description around the world. The word isn't to be encouraged. You know, we talk about conflict, we talk about wars as conflict. No one wants to be associated with that, with those behavior in the workplace.
Yeah, those negative views of it. Let me prod you further, because we're promoting the idea of more conflict and cognitive conflict. But why, from your perspective, why would teams need more conflict in the way they operate with each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for me that a team without conflict is potentially living in this state of false harmony, artificial harmony, where actually, because we are afraid to say what we think, or we don't want to say what we think, or we can't bother to say what we think, we don't want to share our views for a multitude of reasons, there's a real risk that actually topics don't get bubbled to the surface. They don't have that full discussion. And unless we allow people, everybody in this room, be it in person or virtual, to have their say, how can we possibly expect people then to buy in to whatever decision has been made? I think the biggest risk of a team that doesn't talk with passion and embrace this idea of having a disagreement about something, but being able to walk away at the end and still be a cohesive team and still be able to work together. I think there's a real risk that the best decisions are not being made.
I think that's a central point, particularly as you go further up the organizational chain where critical decisions about the business are being made. I don't believe in 100% consensus. And I think that if a team says, oh, we're all in agreement about this, they're not being truthful. Consensus isn't about 100% agreement. Consensus is about, I've fully discussed this deeply. I've had my perspective explored, etc. You know, I've had a full voice, and I can live with the decision we're making together. Doesn't mean I 100% agree with it, but I'm able to live with the collective decision and do something about it, not just sort of passively live with it, but actually commit to actually putting into actions those things that we as a team have agreed on.
Yeah, I think you're right. Often we talk about this in terms of when politics was a slightly more honorable profession or less chaotic, we used to talk about cabinet responsibility. Yeah, this is exactly what we're talking about here. It is about being able to sit around a table of any size, have your say, but when you walk out, you are all saying the same thing, bought into the same thing, and moving in the same direction towards that thing, whether your personal views, 100% agree with it or not. I think often, sadly, we don't see that in the political world wholly, and I don't think we see it in the commercial world either.
I agree. I think you see this in a lot of teams, particularly managerial teams going upwards, that people take sides. It's an adversarial conversation, and therefore becomes, I don't like conflict because it's an argument.
Yeah.
But actually, in terms of a need, why have more cognitive conflict is one of the purposes of doing it is to mine for the best idea, not your idea or my idea, but having really, really deep conversations, because sometimes there might be a third way that emerges. It's like the innovative side of thinking where teams explore deeply and out pops collectively a much better decision or solution to the problem that we're grappling with. I think where it gets tricky, as you say, is I do think there's this element of, and I ask the question, how much do you as an individual care about the thing we're talking about? Because if you have a high degree of, I care about it, it's really important to me, etc., you're really going to advocate for your perspective. But if it's neither here nor there, you might pull out of the conversation, and that's the reality of the interaction sometimes. But we want to avoid both. We want to either avoid both or have both. Really get people to explore options, solutions, because that's where you get the best decision making and everyone's voice in the room.
Yeah. I think this point about how much you care about something is an enabler towards conflict, cognitive conflict. And it's almost like a correlation, I think, around that. And If I can share a quick story, I worked with a client, a leadership team, a departmental team, a business unit. It was for an organization, and within this, it was the IT director that was heading this up. However, sitting around this table, not only were there people that were in charge of app development, architect, and all the normal IT stuff that I'm not too hot on, but also people responsible for facilities. We had the head of security, and we had a couple of other roles that didn't quite fit within the IT portfolio. There was then this big conversation about, well, actually, do you know what? You were trying to encourage me to have this passionate conversation, to embrace conflict. But one, I don't necessarily know what you're talking about. Two, it has zero impact on my role and my teams. And three, I'm actually now seeing this as a waste of time. And I think because of that, those individuals that weren't connected to that particular conversation just felt, do you know what? I'm just going to step back. I'm going to abdicate all responsibility for this, not going to engage. I'm just going to sit there quietly. And I think that is often a common approach. And one of the outcomes was the team raised the question, do we have the right organizational structure? That was really powerful. They realized they were just a group of people brought together under one director. And I've come across that before, but it's quite common.
It is very common. Back end of last year, with a regional leadership group, I was having that same conversation. We had people representing legal, somebody representing corporate affairs, etc. And the conversation was a very, very operational issue. And in fact, some of them at the break said to me, I could have been doing emails. I'd like to ask more about that. I think two factors may be at play. One factor is an individual's relationship to conflict. So how I approach when I'm involved in a conflict conversation. So my own personal approach to that. And the other one is, how does that approach play out in terms of behaviors? Because obviously, as a human being, we're full of behaviors, our own personal styles and a personal approach. Let's kick that idea around. Start with people's approach to conflict. We know some people want to run away from it and really don't want it, and they see it totally as a negative thing. So that's a mindset issue as well as a personal psychology point of view and preference point of view. And other people, if we just take the whole continuum, shades of grays, other people at the other end of the scale are going to go, bring it on, because I'm going to roll my sleeves up and not shy away. So in sort of flight or fright language, it's a movement towards that conflicting conversation or a movement away from that conflicting conversation. What's your handle on people's approach to it first?
I think it's far more nuanced than just an inbuilt reaction to conflict. So I think there are a number of things at play. First and foremost, we have the culture around the table. If the group culture was personified, behaviors around embracing conflict, being straightforward, saying things how they are, being quite determined, etc., are all rewarded by the rest of that team, then it's probably likely there's going to be more conflict. If the leader actually tends to acknowledge and reward behaviors that are much more about compliance and sitting quietly and going with what they suggest, then I would suggest, irrespective of your natural tendency, there is likely to be a reluctance to embrace conflict because of the fact that ultimately, we have things like personal protection in play, psychological safety in play. We have people's career aspirations in play here. All of these things make up this very nuanced approach, but a lot of it is led, I think, by the group culture. So that would be my first point. However, if you then sort of say, let's assume that the group culture is one that is embracing conflict and encouraging conflict. Again, people need to be given the space to do that. So you will have some people sitting around that table that absolutely will be the first ones leading from the front, always the first to talk. They're out there within seconds of something being promoted. You're going to get others that are going to want to sit back and they're going to want to digest, be a little bit more reflective, a little bit more cautious about their approach. maybe they won't table their opinion unless someone invites them to do it. So again, there is this need for this group to work together to be able to say, Joe, you've had a few minutes to think of what are your thoughts. So I think you've got at your extremes that you were talking about there, absolutely, with a sort of a big umbrella over the top, which is what does this group actually reward? What behaviors do we actually punish? Are criticized in that particular way as well.
You've provoked my thinking on this. I do think the climate, the culture of the team, the group, does come into play. Where I think I'm sort of struggling, or I'm sitting on the fence a little bit with it, is, this culture, this climate doesn't sort of just come to fruition overnight. There are influences. The behavioral norms of individuals contribute to the overarching cultural climate of the team, and also the influence of the team leader. If the team leader just wants an agenda where we don't discuss anything and we get to item 3 and he just wants to bang on item 4, influences greatly. I do agree. The climate, the culture of the group is a big influence, but I don't want us to disregard individuals' preferences as well. I think the issue you're making is how, because we discussed this previously and on other occasions, that if there is acceptance in a team that everybody has got a different style potentially, and some styles will overlap and some styles won't, but we've got a number of styles in a room together, in our group, in our team, then acknowledgement of that then requires them to figure out, well, how do we handle those relationships where we have different styles? And then you throw in the notion of conflict in a team and a full deep discussion. The members of that team have to then take into consideration that we've got a range of styles in the room, in this team, and therefore we're going to have different approaches to these deep conversations. Some people will need to think about it a bit more before I open my mouth, and others will go, no, my first idea is the one that I'm going with, and I'll advocate for that really strongly. So,
yeah, absolutely. Because of that mix of behavioral style, my area of specialism is around the DISC model. And if we think about it in terms of behavioral styles being a tendency around the way we behave, you're absolutely right. Sitting around that table, there are going to be some productive behaviors that exist around conflict. Sometimes it just needs someone to lead the way and table what they're thinking in order that we have this sort of halo effect or ripples that then start to come off to reach this best possible conclusion, which is what we were talking about at the beginning. You've got other styles within this that are going to be, much more showing a lot more empathy, I guess, maybe. So if the topic under discussion has a significant impact on people, for example, they may be the ones that are ready and willing to flag that rather than necessarily going with the evidential-based data and facts that are coming through there. But also, conscious, emotionally intelligent enough to be able to read the room, see where this conflict is on the scale at the moment. Is this still productive? Is this delivering what we need? Do they need to lighten the mood, change the tone, and bring other things into it by level of this empathy? And then, of course, you've got others particularly that are going to be much more tactful. Maybe they need some encouragement to actually have this conversation. Maybe somebody needs to ask them a few more questions about what they say. Maybe someone doesn't need to expect them to have an opinion straight away. But all being said, everyone must have an opportunity to have a say. And I think it's about then finding some mechanics and processes in order that can take place.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that something that stood out for me in what you said is, in thinking about styles and different styles that may exist, all styles have their strengths, aren't they? And potentially some limitations in the way that they get sort of deployed. And I think that where, if I just use the analogy of cake mixture, the other ingredient that comes into play is something we've mentioned already, is the extent to which I personally care about the thing that we're talking about. Because, that's, let's call it the rise of the blood on the subject. For some styles, well, all styles really, when you throw that additional ingredient, what I think I've noticed over the years is that some of the behavioral indicators of the not so helpful or unproductive behaviors start showing up. So, I mean, let's just take somebody who's really into the data and how accuracy of the data and making sure that we're talking about the real problems as opposed to the surface ideas we've got, etc. If they are happy to be on the edges of their conversation and need more thinking time to get to grips with the substance of the conversation, they may not be that involved. As you say, what they need from their team members is being drawn out to sort of ask some questions, brought into the conversation. But I think that the reverse can be true as well, even for this individual. They're very data driven, or they care a lot about accuracy. And so, while somebody's talking, they've already figured out the 20 ways why that idea won't work. They'll come into the conversation with the facts, figures, and actually some of their behaviors, some of their tactics in that situation, for others, feels like over-analysis or over-reticence, sort of being really risk-averse around that subject area, et cetera, et cetera. So, or being, because they're good with data, maybe being, I don't know, sounding like they're overly critical with somebody else. This is why we want more of the cognitive, productive conflict conversations, because the purpose it being we get more innovation, more creativity, fulsome discussion of the subjects, and better decision making. We need it for those reasons, but we need to be cognizant that we're all human beings, and we all have our own personal styles and psychology, and we probably are going to engage with that moment of conflict conversations in different ways. The next question is, we know it's good to have. How do we handle it? What could we actually do to promote more productive conflict conversations and less of the destructive ones, which, breaks up the team and maybe even creates tension between individuals?
Mm. Yeah, the first thing goes back to exactly what you're saying there, is about actually a recognition amongst this team that actually people are going to respond in different ways. And actually an acceptance of it as well,
Yeah.
and an encouragement of it, because actually, gosh, it would be so boring if everybody was identical. When we throw something out there, be prepared. If Bob is going to react in a particular way, maybe it's a little bit hot-headed. His first view is going to be his first view. It's what he does all the time. Let's be prepared for it. Likewise, be prepared that someone else is going to be a little bit more reticent to take part and is going to be diving into that data immediately. So I think, so first of all, that understanding of those different styles within the team is really important, and just accepting that actually everyone is going to approach this differently. But then it's about making sure that somehow what we do is we ensure that we are still having this conversation and we are moving forward with it. And I think one of the things I really like, and a client of mine uses it for Unlocked, is, I mentioned Lencioni very briefly at the beginning of the conversation, and so much of what we've talked about goes back to some of his work in the 5 dysfunctions of a team. But he talks about this conflict continuum.
Yeah.
One end of the extreme, you've got behaviors of artificial harmony, where everyone's backing off, not wanting to say anything. At the other extreme, you've got this sort of personal attacks, big, ugly, fat, horrible conflict that really isn't appropriate in the workplace, appropriate at all, to be honest. And somewhere in the middle, there's this tipping point. And I think it is okay to move towards more robust conversations. It's okay to move towards the middle, as long as we can bring it back. How do you do that? Well, a client of mine, on their wall, they have created this conflict continuum, and they have a little arrow. And as the meeting is progressing, they move the arrow.
Brilliant.
They actually move it from saying, well, hang on, folks, we are stuck down here in artificial harmony, and we're going to sit here all day, and nothing is going to change. So how do we move forward? And then if it gets a little bit too robust, if I want to use that word again, the arrow moves along, and they think, okay, should we take 5? Should we just see where we are? Should we just try and bring this back?
Love it.
Although it sounds a bit cheesy and a bit contrived, so much of this for me is about finding a mechanism to talk about what behaviors are happening at the moment. Because if you can't talk about the behaviors at the moment, you're never going to be able to talk about finding a solution in a robust and way that is productive around conflict. So I like that tool. I think it's a good idea. I don't think you want to use it forever, because where you want to get to is the point where people around that table are so cognizant of, the need for moving that arrow along the continua, that actually it happens naturally. And if it doesn't happen, people call each other out over that, and they're ready to hold people accountable and to be able to say, well, actually, hang on a minute, we're stuck down here. Why are we not having this conversation?
I love using whatever works for the team and that they agree, that prompts that kind of positive response. I do argue with a lot of clients, particularly when they approach me and say, I want you to, I don't know, train us on how to manage our conflict conversations more effectively. And very often I when I get into the discussion about it, I realize that actually we're tackling the surface or the presenting problem, where their angle of attack is skills development. To give us some skills, or maybe some tools, perhaps like the continuum or other techniques, various stuff like that. When we discuss it a bit, you realize the answer to the problem is somewhere else. Lincoln is brilliant on this, because we need to create sufficient amounts of interpersonal trust and psychological safety for them to feel comfortable to have robust conversations, knowing full well that it's not going to ruin how we feel about each other and the teaminess of the emotional connections we might have as friends. Often the answer to the presenting problem is not by tackling the presenting problem only, but is maybe taking a step back and coming at it in terms of more fundamental stuff, in terms of how the team might operate. Then you've raised a really important one, because I think this notion of acceptance and awareness, for me, it's like when, I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Kilman's conflict instrument. If people do it, they get a description of their typical approach to conflict. Okay, there's these 5 different approaches. We've raised their awareness about how they might say, typically on average, kind of, because everybody's singularly in the way they do things, but just generally speaking, this is their approach. They've got raised awareness. We share this and other people accept it. They still don't know what to do with it. The next step is, well, yeah, okay, so I know a bit more about each other, and what next? This is where it moves into the skillsy bit, or being able to use awareness in the moment and having awareness of others, not just myself, about how this conversation, which is a robust, exploratory conversation where there is argument about the subject, there's cognitive conflict, and we're now deploying some skills in our dialogue, and I actually call it skillful dialogue. And I think there's two things here that relate to how to handle it. In an argument, very often people tend to advocate their point of view. If they're not getting far, they advocate even harder, almost like the law court. Advocating is, this is my proposition, and I'm going to argue that proposition even harder, etc., trying to convince somebody. And what I say to them is, you need to put that on the table, of course, but in equal measure, you need inquiry. And inquiry is about soliciting from the other person the origins of the thought that they just expressed to you. So sort of trying to get the thinking, I call it the thinking behind the thinking. How come you've got that perspective? What's influencing? What are the factors that are leading you to conclude this? And that balance of skillful dialogue between advocating my point of view and inquiring around the origins of the other person's idea, that's where the richness of the debate can emerge, and you get much greater understanding and appreciation. Ultimately, what I found when I've really forced this with teams is they do have much better result conversations where everybody does feel that they've, at least my tuppence worth has been heard and listened to. And even if my idea wasn't the one that we went with, because I felt that I had a full chance to express my view, I'm more likely to support and commit to whatever we agree on as a group.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, some of the issues that in terms of doing something about it, that we need to play with a bit.
I really like what you were saying about inquiry, and it's so important. And I think we've lost the skill to do that sufficiently. I often talk about being curious with a lot of sales teams, and it's like, where's your curiosity gone? When we were kids, we had that innate curiosity. We all remember, our own kids or other people's kids, the why phase, when they just want to know everything and they want to absorb everything. We then seem to reach this point where we think, well, actually, I can't ask those questions anymore for a variety of reasons, because either I'm not interested really in why you're saying what you're saying or why you're advocating a particular view. My view's more important, and I'm ready to get that on the table and dismiss yours. Or generally, I just don't care enough. And I think there is a desperate need for curiosity when it comes to conflict. If we can understand people's perspectives about why they're advocating for a certain thing, we might agree, or we might change our mind and support what they're saying, which is okay too. And I think, there is no need to be completely fixed in our views.
The skillsy side of things, the things that we can help team members to be better at, is the use of language around curiosity. So, getting them to first of all, the mindset of being more curious, obviously, because there's a value to it. But then deploying it with language that solicits ideas. They might say, help me understand the origins of that idea, or tell me more about the factors on your mind. Having curiosity is one thing. How it translates into the dialogue or the conversation is definitely dependent not only on how it's delivered, obviously, so it's not demeaning and all of these sort of not helpful approaches, but it's deployed in a way that reinforces, I actually am curious. I actually want to understand more deeply. Why is it you can't see the world from my perspective, Gary, kind of thing. So that's the training part, I think.
And that is so important, because I think often, in particular when we go back to styles, there are some styles that, when they're in full curiosity mode, can actually come across as quite as if they're being overly critical, or challenging, or interrogative, or all these sorts of things that actually make them go, whoa, hang on a minute, when actually all they're trying to do is to find out. But instead of using language like you just described, tell me more about, or explain how you came to that view, are actually just saying, why is that? And immediately you've got that sort of the hands go up on the back of your neck, because you think about, I'm now under attack, when actually that's not the intent. You're right. The skills training around that can be really helpful.
You're probably familiar with this one. A really simple thing and I get people to sort of give feedback when they hear it, reinforcing feedback actually, is, how very often in language, the challenge of the use of the word but is that we kind of go, I'm listening to you, but, and the but comes across as, I'm now going to discount everything you've said, and now I'm going to put my point of view forward. And one of the little sort of techniques, I suppose, that sometimes helps is so it's the difference between saying yes, but, which you hear all the time, to yes, and. Now, the and still allows you to get your point across, but it feels to the receiver like it's a build on, whereas yes, but feels like I'm discounting. So that simple technique of making your point after somebody's with a yes, and rather than a yes, but creates a fuller discussion, allows another perspective to come across not as a disagreement or an attack, but rather a build. That's a simple technique that can be used. I love the arrow and the continuum, and people giving each other feedback, being conscious and intentional in the moment, which, to be fair, depending on how much I care about the subject, might be a little bit tricky because I'll get carried away with my own emotions around it,
Intent's really important. Actually, how do we get teams to trigger conflict in the first place sometimes? You mentioned no need to get involved. I don't want to get too involved in this conversation. I'm wondering whether a simple question to yourself or the group is, do we need to go into conflict mode? Do we not need to do this? Or are we okay with the decision that's been made? Everybody is committed to it. Everyone's bought into it. Let's not spend unnecessary time being overly curious and diving deeper when it's not necessary. If you step back and think, do I need to speak out loud? Is the conflict phase over? Are we ready to move into somewhere else? And I think that sort of thought around it can really help, because I think there's a risk as well if you spend too much time on conflict or on conflict type behaviors and those productive conversations. Hopefully those that want to move things forward at a pace will get frustrated. Are you being productive? Does it need to be talked about time and time again? Once everyone's had their say, let's come to an agreement decision. Conflict phase over, move on.
I want to get my priorities straight, and thank you very much for that thought provocation and for kicking around the ideas with you. I'm going back to that central point we talked about at the beginning. Productive conflict, we need more of it, but it has to be mastered. Teams need to know how much of it, when to do it, and do it skillfully.
Yeah, absolutely agree. It's been a real pleasure, James. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gary. Look after yourself. Catch up soon. And there you go. Another GOBO session wrapped up. Hopefully, we haven't convinced you to start a fight in your next team meeting. But if you've found some value in the idea of healthy conflict, hit subscribe. Leave a comment if you've had any memorable team showdowns, the good, the bad, or the ugly. And share this with any team that you know who are a little too conflict averse. It might stir up the right conversations, you never know. Until next time, bye for now.